Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is November 16th, 2015, and we have a number of different issues that we want to talk about tonight. Last few weeks, we've been trying to catch up a little bit on the Syrian crisis for the weeks that I was absent on the show and cover a number of other issues as well. But tonight, of course, we've got to address pressing matters. That is the attacks in Paris. The Paris attacks, the 7 different attacks committed at the same time in Paris, much larger in scale than the Charlie Hebdo attacks, much larger loss of life, much larger French reaction to the attacks as well. So we're going to see probably a much heavier response in terms of the world oligarchy and what they want and seek to gain from these attacks, and we'll talk about those in somewhat detail tonight. Also, I want to get into the Russian plane. Remember the other terrorist attack that occurred just a week ago, and which is now overshadowed by the Paris attack. So we're becoming a world in which terror attacks on larger and larger scales are becoming part of the new normal, and I believe this was written about before, and researchers like Alan Watt have talked about this before, but this is apparently becoming the new normal. And we're going to talk about who is responsible for these terrorist attacks, who the ultimate blame lies with, and what this means. So we'll get into that tonight. But before I do, I want to encourage you to catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage, ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. You'll find archives and such on that webpage. If you're interested in my work, then it comes out regularly at activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, theantimedia.org. But of course, if you're interested in my work specifically, BrandonTurbeville.com is where you want to be. That's the website that I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the interviews, all of the archive versions of this show. All of that stuff is there, all of the relevant information. The books there as well. There's a books tab that you should be able to find. The books, we announced last week that we were trying to get the books up on Amazon finally, because we were having trouble doing that with the publishing company, the publisher that we were on before. But now that issue is being taken care of. So we're getting on Amazon. The Codex Alimentarius End of Health Freedom book is now available on Amazon in hardback, well, not hardback, but hard copy form, paperback form. It's available there. Shipping is fast. Shipping is not that bad in terms of cost compared to what it was. And of course, the difference it makes, 36 Reasons Why Hillary Clinton Should Never Be President, now available on Amazon, both in paperback and Kindle edition. So you can find that on Amazon. Christmas is coming up. I hear a lot of people are interested in Hillary Clinton and Codex Alimentarius. So if you're interested in supporting me and buying some Christmas gifts, those are just some ideas, hint, hint. And we'll have more books coming up on Amazon in the near future. So again, BrandonTurbeville.com is where you want to go. We've already got articles up regarding the Paris attacks, articles to come on the Russian plane, possibly more articles to come on the Paris attacks. By the time you listen to the show, which is being pre-recorded on November 15th, you'll know some of this information. I have done a number of radio broadcasts on Sunday and into Monday, so you'll have seen some of this information. But we're going to go over it nonetheless. Bear in mind, though, that the show being pre-recorded 24 hours ahead of time, a lot of things can change in the field. A lot of information can come to light in the meantime. So let's talk about the Paris attacks. What happened here, of course, one of the largest terror attacks in the world since 9/11, if you don't count the Anglo-American imperialist terror attacks that have taken place all across the world, which have been which everything else would pale in comparison to hundreds of thousands, to millions of people dead. But of course, for sake of the general discussion, we'll refer to the terrorist attacks as committed by Islamic fundamentalist or small groups that are listed as terrorist organizations like ISIS, But, of course, the real terrorists are the people who have killed 1 million Iraqis, hundreds of thousands of Middle Easterners, Syrians, Lebanese, Palestinians, Iraqis, all of these guys who've committed these attacks on these sovereign nations are truly terrorists in the true sense of the word. But let's look at what happened in Paris. Okay, we had explosions outside the stadium, the French stadium. There was an apparent suicide bombing that was committed outside of the stadium where Germany and France were playing a soccer game that was being attended by President Hollande. The bombings forced Hollande to evacuate the stadium, convene an emergency cabinet meeting. A reporter from the Associated Press was there in the stadium at the time of the suicide bombing. He described 2 explosions and said that they were both loud enough to be heard over the sounds of the fans. So they were quite loud and quite large. There were the concert hall attacks. There's as many as 100 people were killed at the concert venue known as the Bataclan during the concert of the American band Eagles of Death Metal. There was 100 hostages that were taken at the venue. One witness had been quoted by BFM TV, French TV, claims to have heard rounds of automatic rifle fire and screams of Allahu Akbar. Other witnesses said they heard the shooter screaming, "This is for Syria, this is for Syria." Other reports still claim that grenades were lobbed. A separate witness who escaped the concert hall stated, quote, "When they started shooting, we just saw flashes. People got down on the ground right away," end quote. We had Julien Pierce, a French radio reporter who was inside the theater when the gunmen entered. He said there were 2 gunmen. He said that both men were dressed in black and began shooting what he says were AK-47s. He said neither of them wore masks. They didn't say anything. The gunfire lasted for about 10 to 15 minutes, and after people who were wounded fell on the floor, they approached them and shot them again, execution style, and killed them. Pierce said he personally saw 20 to 25 bodies on the floor. Other witnesses described the gunmen as firing shotguns into the crowd. The police allegedly killed 2 armed men whom they believed opened fire at the theater. We also had an attack at the restaurant Le Carillon. It was a shooting there. At least 12 people were killed in that attack. It was located in the 10th arrondissement. It is close to the offices of the Charlie Hebdo magazine publication, so it's not far down the road from that. The assailants allegedly have not yet been caught. The shooting was described as a drive-by method, so they never really got out the car, apparently. We also had another restaurant shooting at Le Petit Cambodge. I believe that's Little Cambodia. I believe that's what that translates to be. It was another restaurant that was supposedly filled with foreign students. The shooting began around 7 p.m. local time, and according to witnesses, they used 1 or 2 cars in the shooting there as well. There were 3 other sites where there were shootings and multiple explosions across Paris at the same time. And shortly after the attacks, we had a number of social media accounts associated with ISIS praising the attacks. I think we now have media accounts praising, not just praising the accounts, but the attacks, but I think we have social media accounts belonging to ISIS who are taking credit for it. Of course, we can see a license plate from outer space, but we can't shut a terrorist website down. We can't shut a terrorist Twitter account down, despite the fact that Twitter can shut down activist pages at a moment's notice. But ISIS, they just outsmart Twitter left and right, don't they? Because I guess that's where they're getting their donations from. Anyway, let's continue with the report before we get on to this. The attacks, we should mention, come ahead of a major global climate conference that was supposed to begin sometime in the next 2 weeks. France had already heightened the security measures against the conference because of the fear of mass protest and what they say potential terrorist attacks. Let's take a look at what we see here. That's the basics of what happened. But let's take a look at what we might be able to gather. Generally speaking, the reports coming out immediately in a situation like this, contrary to popular belief, the reports coming out immediately are generally the ones that are more reliable, because you don't have the yes, it's the fog of war kind of situation, but you don't have the ability to whitewash the story. Everyone's confused. Everyone's hearing different stories. And later on comes the whitewash. We'll get into how that happens in a minute. So that's why we try to get these things as soon as possible. But we see now France has declared a mandatory curfew, which means it's its first mandatory curfew since the Nazis occupied France in 1944. So clearly, France in 2015 represents France in 1944 more than anything else. So congratulations, that's your freedom and democracy. Remember that the next time you put that stupid French flag on your Facebook page, or you go out and wear a shirt or put a sticker that says Je suis Charlie or Je suis France. Well, yeah, where's your freedom and democracy? All right, these people have reverted to the time of the Nazis when there was a mandatory curfew in the streets of Paris. Only hours after the first shots were fired, we had stories and reports that were beginning to contradict and change and seem different to the original accounts. Considering the history of the French government and the French intelligence agencies and the Anglo-American NATO intelligence apparatus, particularly the recent events surrounding the Charlie Hebdo attacks that were exposed as false flags, particularly, we did that here on this show and on this website, BrandonTurbeville.com, so you should go back and read that. We would definitely be justified in wondering whether or not these recent attacks were part of the same variety, and I believe that they were. I will go out and say this. I believe that these attacks were of the false flag variety, designed to do a number of things which we will get into. So let's look at some of the evidence that I have here for the potential for a false flag. And again, I don't want to say that this is 100% concrete proof, but these are the types of things that you have to look for. Number one, how many gunmen were involved in this attack? Already, the number of people involved in the Paris attacks is in question. Some reports suggested 4 shooters were involved. Others suggested 3. The majority of mainstream reports now seem to only be acknowledging 2 shooters. So, how many shooters were there? Were there 2? Were there 3? Were there 4? We have one witness, Pierre-Marie Bertin, who's a 36-year-old who was at the theater when the shooting began. He said that there were as many as 4 gunmen. He described some male hostages who, quote, went onto the balcony and tried to negotiate for the life of their wives with one of the guys being terrorists. It was sickening, end quote. He recounted somewhat more detail than some of the other witnesses, and it was clear that there were as many as 4 gunmen. Australian news media is reporting that 3 gunmen have been killed. All right, so 3 gunmen, according to Australian media, were killed by police. Now, this might seem inconsequential to a lot of readers, but people who are researching these types of events, it's well known that information that comes out shortly after the event is usually the most reliable, as I said earlier. This is not to discount the existence of confusion related to panic reports coming from eyewitnesses and etc., but the information coming out early on has not yet been subjected to the top-down media revision that's inevitably going to take place as the story becomes molded to fit the narrative pushed by the individuals who either directed the attack at the higher levels of society or at least have connections with those who are able to control the manner in which various media outlets report the event. So in times of false flag attacks, the initial reports may point, for instance, to 5 gunmen, and very shortly after, reports may only mention 2 gunmen, and a few hours later after the attack, we have no more than 1 gunman. Just one person there. Everybody else has been removed entirely, and we have the lone gunman story, and any other mention of additional gunmen is reduced as conspiracy theory and ridiculed as such. So that's the type of thing you have to be looking at. So how many gunmen were there? Were there 2, 3, 4? What was it? Now, number 2, I want to mention the types of weapons used. Some reports, as I mentioned earlier, were saying they were using AK-47s. Other reports suggested that they were using shotguns. Well, the contradiction in reports, you can really attribute that sometimes to victims or witnesses not really being aware of the type of weapons used in the attacks, panic in the heat of the moment, that sort of thing. But that is a contradiction nonetheless. AK-47s and shotguns are very different weapons, although you can say that some people, particularly in a place like France, might not know the difference. But shotguns and AK-47s are very different. There's been no clarification as to what type of weapons were used, at least that I can see. So the assailants were allegedly killed by police, right? So it should be clear what kind of weapons they used. We should be able to go to the crime scene and see, was it shotguns, was it AK-47s, what was it? Now, were the gunmen killed or were they arrested? We've got the number of gunmen itself in doubt. But we got news reports coming from Fox News and Sky News suggesting that a suspected gunman was actually arrested. So, in fact, the suspect allegedly stated to police, quote, "I am from ISIS." Well, that's convenient, isn't it? So that gives us all the information we need for who is responsible for this attack. He's arrested. I thought they were killed earlier in reports, but no, now they say a gunman has been arrested and he is from ISIS. Well, was he arrested? Was he killed? Why can't we have the story straight? This is an important point. Number 4 here, gunmen were connected to ISIS and Syria. Now, this is where we have to ask cui bono, right? Who benefits? Now, along with the very convenient and immediate statement by an allegedly arrested suspect that he was from ISIS, we also have the screams of a shooter. Remember, this is for Syria. This is for Syria. This gives us all the information that we need as the gullible general public regarding the motivation of the alleged attackers. They're from ISIS. They hate the French because the French are allegedly attacking ISIS, and because somewhere in France, in a very darkened corner, under the sofa, there are freedoms. ISIS hates freedoms, so that's what we're given, right? This is very coincidental considering the fact that a Russian airliner was recently bombed, allegedly by ISIS, at least according to the West, about a week before, but we'll get into that in a minute. The timing of the event is indeed very interesting. Aside from the obvious connections, because the attacks took place on Friday the 13th, this Paris massacre has taken place shortly before a major climate summit that was set to take place in France. The French government was expecting massive protests. They could allegedly become violent. That's what the French government was claiming. Activists, of course, were opposed to globalization and energy austerity. But what's interesting is that France had already planned to impose border controls starting on November 30th in anticipation of the UN Conference on Climate Change in Paris, quote, because of the terrorist threat or risk of public disorder, end quote. So, needless to say, there will be no massive protests now, considering the fact that 2015 France really resembles the 1943 version of itself more than anything else. So, sorry, protesters. I doubt that you'll be able to go out there and throw a fit about the global climate change energy austerity conference where they plan to take away your ability to heat and cool yourself and to essentially feed yourself on the altar of this ridiculous climate change fraud. So you won't be able to do that because some terrorists who were connected to Western intelligence blew up a car outside of a stadium and went on a shooting rampage. Also, we would be remiss in our duty if we did not point out that all of this shooting occurred. Mass shootings occurred in a place where nobody is armed. Gun control works, right? Right, white liberals? Gun control works. Go look at France. Over 158 dead. Congratulations, once again, on your success. Now, we got to look at the security question because I just mentioned the Global Climate Change Conference. Considering the fact that the security had been so heightened, both on the heels of the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the anticipation of the social disorder for the UN Conference on Climate Change, how on earth did such a major terror attack slip through the hands of the DGSE? How did that happen? After all, France isn't anything if it's not a police state. It's given the United States a run for its money in the contest about how much private information it's able to nab up on its citizens. Well, of course, we're going to be given the line, and we have already been given the line, that pre-civilized savages outsmarted first world high-end military surveillance states. Once again, well, apparently donkeys and a couple of walkie-talkies can outsmart the world society, the world security apparatus. So watch out, Western world. If anybody arms themselves with a walkie-talkie, a donkey, and a turban, it's over for Western society. The secret's out. You know, Bin Laden did it. The 7/7 bombers did it. We've got Charlie Hebdo attacks did it. Paris gunmen did it. The Sinai guys did it with the Russian plane. So the cat's out of the bag. All you need is some radical Wahhabist ideology and a good donkey to carry your backpack, and you can defeat the world security apparatus. Please. Now, drills. Drills is something else that we have to look at. We always look at drills, military exercises, police exercises, and that sort of thing. That's one of the hallmarks of the false flag operation, the running of drills. And we actually do have a drill. So we had reports coming from the UK that the UK were conducting counterterrorism drills earlier this year that included scenarios that involved terror attacks in Paris, similar to the ones that took place in the Charlie Hebdo attacks, right? The reports surrounding the UK drills were released. We had a number 10 spokesman confirmed, quote, "It had been agreed that future exercises, which take place on a regular basis, should seek to learn from events in France." And then we had David Cameron himself stating that there was a need for police to, quote, "to call on military help if there was a major emergency," end quote. Well, that's been the agenda the whole time, right? Why do they need to call on the military for help? They look like the damn military already, so they should be able to go out and nobody would know the difference. Look at France right now. It really does look like 1943. Now, speaking of Charlie Hebdo, let's mention that. The recent attacks were so similar to the Charlie Hebdo massacre that occurred earlier this year. Charlie Hebdo was largely revealed as a false flag operation. We're not going to get into all that now. Go read my article, 15 Signs the Charlie Hebdo Attack Was a False Flag. So there's a clear precedent for the attacks in France, albeit on a much larger scale this time around. Now, who are we blaming for the attacks? This is one of the most important parts. Well, it's ISIS, right? ISIS has taken credit for it. France says it's ISIS. The United States says it's ISIS. The mainstream media says it's ISIS. Well, okay, it's ISIS. Fine. We'll say it's ISIS. To a lot of people who listen to this stuff in the mainstream media, they're going to say, well, if it's ISIS, all right, terrorist attack. But that's not a deal breaker, right? Who is really responsible here? For the general public, they view ISIS as some shadowy terrorist organization that somehow supports itself on oil revenue and Twitter donations, and donations that we really can't tell where they come from. Again, the world security apparatus can read a license plate from outer space, see a grasshopper on a flower from outer space, but they just can't tell who's buying the oil from ISIS, who's marching across Syria and Iraq in a massive caravan. They just can't tell where they're getting all this money from, despite the fact that they can tell every single thing that you're doing online. But a Twitter account just can't get shut down for an ISIS member. But this is not what ISIS is, right? ISIS is actually created, controlled, directed, funded by the United States government. So, again, for many people who watch this stuff on mainstream media, they're going to see this shadowy terrorist organization. They don't know where they get their funding. It supports itself. They're 10 feet tall. They're supermen. They can't be defeated except when the Russians actually bomb it, and then all of a sudden they fall apart. But hey, that's not part of the mainstream narrative. So the facts don't support a shallow understanding of ISIS in this way. Again, ISIS was entirely created, funded, and directed by the United States, by Britain, and by France, and other NATO countries, a part of this NATO bloc. Turkey, especially Turkey. Of course, GCC countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, those places are involved as well, and we can't forget the Israelis in this situation either. So ISIS and all of its actions have been coordinated by the Anglo-American intelligence apparatus for geopolitical purposes all across the world, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Chechnya, whether it's in Nigeria, or whether it's here at home, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in France, whether it's in Britain. All of this has been coordinated by the Anglo-American intelligence apparatus. And I've demonstrated that repeatedly. We've got a number of articles that I've written, and I'll give you the names of those articles shortly. So, this is the reason why the declaration that ISIS committed a terrorist attack in Paris, that is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for the Western intelligence apparatus. In fact, that's the trademark of their handiwork. So if you want to say, oh, well, ISIS committed the terrorist attack, yeah, sure, fine. ISIS committed the terrorist attack, but who controls ISIS? I think you need to go back to the DGSE, you need to go back to MI6, you need to go back to the CIA and ask them for information on that. Those are the people you need to bring up on trial. Sure, deal with the terrorists, but you're never going to get anything done if you don't start looking at the CIA, at the Western intelligence apparatus, because that is the head of the snake. That is the controlling head of ISIS. Go read my article, The Roots of ISIS. Go read my other article, Former Al-Qaeda Operative Claims Al-Qaeda ISIS Run by the CIA. Syria Under Attack by Globalist Death Squad Experts. Go read those articles, and you'll see who is behind ISIS. As a matter of fact, go get my book, The Road to Damascus, The Anglo-American Assault on Syria, and read that book, and you'll see clearly who is behind ISIS. This is not some conspiracy theory. It's well documented. Defense Intelligence Agency documents have shown that as well. So this is something that's very well documented. Now, I want to go through a number of other things that I didn't have in my article. I have an article up entitled 9 Reasons to Question the Paris Terror. 9 Reasons to Question the Paris Terror Attacks. Go read that article, and you'll see the information that I've just listed in terms of who might be responsible for these attacks and basically the questionable aspects of this narrative. But as I said, in a matter of hours, more information could come to light. So in the amount of hours that it took after that article was out, there is more information that has come to light. And I want to bring some of that out here on the show. We have a report that the French equivalent of MI6 and CIA, that is the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, that's the DGSE, basically. The director, Bernard Bajolet, is meeting or had met with the CIA and MI6 directors shortly before the terrorist attacks. So we had a report coming from MSNBC's Brian Williams on Friday evening, actually. Haim, the Canal's website, Laura Haim, she was one of the reporters during a live report with MSNBC's Brian Williams. She stated that the CIA director, John Brennan, recently met with the French intelligence director, Bernard Bajolet, and there was this article, CIA GW Intelligence Conference, Panel on the Shared 21st Century International Mission, GW Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, 29th October 2015, Panel on the Shared 21st Century International Mission, featuring CIA Director John Brennan, former UK MI6 Chief John Sawers, Director of the French Directorate for External Security, Bernard Bajolet, and former Israeli National Security Advisor, Yaakov Amidror. Held as part of a second annual Ethos and Profession of Intelligence Conference, co-hosted by the Central Intelligence Agency and the George Washington University. Again, that's another headquarters for intelligence operations there at George Washington University. So they were meeting on October the 27th, 2015. They met shortly before. I think it goes on to the 28th and 29th as well. So up to the 29th. They had met with each other shortly before the Paris attacks. Now, here's something else. We got a report that a Syrian and an Egyptian passport has been found at the site of the suicide bombing at the stadium Stade de France in Paris. The documents are currently being checked by authorities, or so go the reports. It's also been reported that a set of fingerprints belonging to a French citizen who took part in the terrorist attack were found at the scene. They say 2 of the 7 terrorists responsible for the attacks have been identified. One was a Syrian, another was a French national. A Syrian passport was found on the body of one of the Paris suicide bombers, according to police. Okay, what the hell? A passport. This reminds us, of course, of 9/11. Remember, jet fuel is allegedly so hot, can burn so hot, that it can melt steel beams on a skyscraper, but not paper passports. Here we have a situation in which an individual is a suicide bomber, and I've seen a lot of suicide bombings, ladies and gentlemen, and rarely do the suicide bombers actually have a body left to be identified. What kind of bomb was this guy using? If it was an explosion that was loud enough to be heard over the cheering fans at a soccer game, then that is not believable that his body would still be intact for any type of identification beyond maybe DNA testing of some type. This is not corresponding to what I've seen in the past with suicide bombings. This is nothing of the sort. But a passport, a bomb that is so loud it can be heard over cheering fans at a soccer match that it would blow up and kill a number of different people at these with these bombings, but it doesn't destroy a paper passport. And why would he be carrying a passport to begin with? Put that aside. Put the motivation of why he would actually be carrying a passport to begin with if he was going to commit a suicide bombing. But the question is, would the passport survive the explosion? I think not. So that's another thing that we have to question. We have reports that one of the Paris attackers was a Syrian refugee who arrived in Greece last month. Some of the reports are suggesting that the terrorist involved in the attack was a Syrian refugee, came through Greece. We have Greek journalist Yannis Koutsoumitis. He's been tweeting that the country's Ministry of Public Order and Citizen Protection has confirmed that the terrorist found with a Syrian passport on his person was registered as a refugee on Liros Island in October. Koutsoumitis also has brought attention to a quote by the Greece Migration Minister Yannis Mouzalis on September 9th when he said, quote, "It would be foolish to believe that there are no jihadists among the refugees that cross into Europe." Well, that was another good reason to do what I said and not allow these immigrants in to begin with, period. Europe's already had too much of them. But that actually is not the main issue here. So the Syrian refugee who had a Syrian passport that somehow survived a massive suicide bombing, somehow his body and his passport survived the suicide bombing for us to see. That's very, very coincidental, and that's the type of information that I'm talking about when I say that you have to look at these incidents as false flags. Now, we of course had the SWAT teams. This is something else that we want to point out. At the Bataclan hostage situation, and that's the theater, there were hundreds of people in there. Over 100 were killed, but there were hundreds of people in there being held as hostages. And despite reports that the terrorists were killing people indiscriminately, SWAT teams waited around 2 hours before entering the building, despite tweets from hostages that were suggesting that the terrorists were doing that were killing people indiscriminately. So seemingly it's very bizarre length of time for these guys to wait. If there had been a bunch of French citizens who had, I don't know, expressed a wrong think, or maybe had been smoking pot or something in their apartment, I doubt the SWAT teams would have waited 2 hours. They would have been in the house, had massacred everybody involved, and all done that under 15 minutes. But still, with this situation, they waited 2 hours. It's almost as if they were being given some type of order to maximize the loss of life here. That's what I would suggest. That's what I would suspect. Now, what do you know? The French government knew the extremists before the attack, or at least some of them, right? This is another hallmark. Remember Charlie Hebdo. These guys were on the terrorist watch list. They were being followed, and then all of a sudden they committed terrorist attacks. Some of them, remember, had been arrested for terrorism and were still on the terrorist watch list, were being followed, and then they decided, oh well, we don't have enough evidence to follow them and suspect them anymore. And then in the very amount of time that they stopped following some of the terrorists, they committed terrorist attacks. So all very convenient. Well, we have once again reports coming out from the UK Daily Mail. Hunt for the ISIS killers. One terrorist identified as young Frenchman known to authorities. Another two found with Syrian and Egyptian passports. So we have, quote, one of the terrorists involved in last night's attacks in Paris has been officially identified as a Parisian. According to local media reports, the man who was killed at the Bataclan was identified using his fingerprints and was from the southern Parisian neighborhood of Courcorons. French reports say that the man, who was around 30 years old, was already known to French anti-terrorist authorities prior to last night's attack. And it's not just him. Remember, in this article by the Daily Mail, which is actually a fairly decent article, we've got shortly before the attacks, about a week ago, we had a heavily armed suspect that was stopped on his way to the French capital. But German police who stopped him uncovered an arsenal, what they define as an arsenal of weapons in his car, and he had some coordinates punched into his GPS, and it was Paris, and there was nothing done. At least one of the terrorists, again, one of the Parisian he'd been on the terrorist watch list for 5 years, but the claims are that he was not being monitored closely enough to be stopped before he took part in the attack. Well, that's just not believable. I'm sorry. Not believable at all, especially in the police state that is Paris and France and the rest of the Western world. So remember, we saw after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we saw a relentless call for more police state measures in France to prevent the new Charlie Hebdo attacks. The argument was that French security agencies knew about the extremists, but they weren't able to stop them before carrying out another high-profile attack, even with the enhanced surveillance powers that they had just been given. Well, after Charlie Hebdo, they got more, right? So why did this happen? Why did this happen? The intrusive surveillance laws and policies are increasing by the month, but the terrorist attacks are doing so as well. So it's obviously not working. It's obviously not stopping anything. Now, again, we got to point out that we're being seen here. What we're seeing is this idea, this narrative that one of the attackers was a Syrian refugee, and I should bring that up because we've got to can't not address this. The idea that a Syrian refugee would be one of the attackers. What we're seeing is an attempt to use these attacks for political propaganda purposes. Now, again, my suspicion, my hypothesis is this was entirely created, directed, funded, organized by Western intelligence completely, period. But for the same purposes. At the very least, they just didn't let a good crisis go to waste. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think the case is pretty concrete for ISIS attacks. If it's an ISIS attack, it's a Western intelligence attack. And this was, to me, obviously a false flag. Now, what are they being used for? The attacks are being used for a number of things. One is to drum up support for greater Western involvement in Syria, particularly French involvement in Syria. Remember, every time France seems a little hesitant to get in and bomb some desert sand and Syrian infrastructure, then, of course, we have French reporters being killed, we have French citizens being killed, and we have Charlie Hebdo, and now we have this. So I would see that this will be used for more justification to increase the bombing in Syria, the faux ISIS bombing, right? The alleged ISIS bombing that's not really being conducted against ISIS. It's being conducted against civilians and the Syrian government. So we're going to see that. Of course, the crackdown on what little civil liberties are left in France. Remember, they don't even have freedom of speech. They don't even have freedom of thought in France. So I don't know how many more civil liberties they can handle. Maybe they should just close the borders and just call the whole country a concentration camp. It's not a free society. It's a joke. It's a police state. There's no free speech. It doesn't exist. You can't even question certain historical events without threat of jail. Then you can't offend certain other groups without threat of jail. You're not a free society. And this Je suis Charlie stuff, Je suis France. I'm sorry, it's a joke. But I want to mention the refugee issue. The Syrian refugees, again, as I pointed out here on this show, the majority of refugees coming into Europe are not Syrian. They're African. They're coming from Eritrea. They're coming from Algeria. They're coming from places that are not Syria. And it's bad enough to allow refugees coming, rushing into Europe, especially after the decades of just open floodgates to immigration to begin with, destroyed European culture. And even if the immigration had been stopped a year ago completely, European culture would still be in dire straits because of it. But aside from all of that, and again, my solution was first, shut down the European borders. Don't let any immigrants in. They don't need to be there. Europe can't handle any more of this. But also to stop bombing Syria, to stop bombing Iraq, and mainly stop supporting terrorism. If you don't want the Syrian refugees, the Syrians don't want to be there. They want to be home in Syria, and they can't be there because the United States, Britain, France are bombing the Syrian nation. So those were my solutions to the immigrant crisis, is to stop funding terrorism in Syria and Iraq, stop funding ISIS, to stop bombing in the country, let Assad take back the country, let the Russians take back the country, and simply leave it alone. Actually work with the Assad government to promote development and progression. So that would be the solutions, but of course not to allow the immigrants in. But now they're in. What we're seeing now is, even in the alternative media, reports saying, you see, this is why you don't have an unfettered immigration policy. And with that, we have to say, true, of course. You don't want an unfettered immigration policy because it destroys culture. Your social systems can't hold up to this many immigration, to this many immigrants. And of course, you also see an influx of crime and violence, is what we've seen. Particularly when many of these immigrants aren't the Syrians, and again, the Syrians would have been the better immigrants here to take in, but only 1 in 4 were Syrians, and many out of the Syrian refugees were men of fighting age. So that should tell you what's happening there. So yeah, we agree. This is a great reason why you don't want to have unfettered immigration, but that misses the point. The reason for the terrorist attacks was not the immigration issue. It is not the immigration policy that has caused the terrorist attacks. That is akin to the blowback theory for 9/11. Actually, that is a blowback theory being posited there. This is not simply a situation in which you've let a bunch of people in, you've let a criminal element in with them, and they committed a terrorist attack. That is missing the issue. Blaming the immigration policy is missing the issue. The issue here is Western intelligence apparatus, the Western intelligence apparatus, who committed these terrorist attacks, because it's coordinated. It all happened at the same time. This is as if a military or overarching group controlled this situation. You know, they were at a soccer game where the president was attending. It takes a lot of research to determine where the president is going to be on a Friday night. These things are not released out very far ahead of time, particularly with the aristocratic class like Holland. So blaming the immigration issue itself is missing the mark. This is not the blowback from unfettered immigration. This is a coordinated plan by Western intelligence agencies to drum up support for more war in Syria, because they're getting their ass kicked in Syria, because their proxies are getting their ass kicked by the Russians and the Syrian army and Hezbollah and Iran. And they need to get back in to Syria in full force. They need to get the Russians out. They need to bomb Syrian infrastructure to make Assad weak so they can push their proxy forces even further. So they can heat up the proxy war in Syria against Assad and Iran and Russia. That's what they're attempting to do. That's pretty clear to anybody who can see it. And what do we see now with the catcalls coming out after the attacks? The solution is, we were bombed by ISIS. Let's bomb the forces who are bombing ISIS, right? The idea is that we should bomb Assad's infrastructure, his military infrastructure, so we can protect the moderate cannibals, or excuse me, now the relatively moderate cannibals who raped and beheaded their way across Syria, but they don't call themselves ISIS, or the mainstream media doesn't call them ISIS, so it's okay, and we want savage monkeys to take over Syria. You know, the animals that were the perpetrators of the terrorist attack, that is what we want to see in Syria, according to Hollande, according to France, according to Obama. In other words, terrorist attacks, savagery, animal behavior, murder, rape, beheadings. That's horrible in France. That's horrible in the United States. But in Syria, we want to elect that as we want to put that in place of the elected government. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It's a proxy war, and they want to get back in. They want to use this as justification to do it. And we cannot allow that to happen. One of the ways we cannot allow that to happen is to point out the fact that this was instigated by Western intelligence. If you're ISIS, you are the CIA's Arab Legion. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, same thing. Remember, Al-Qaeda in Iraq and al-Nusra in Syria. It's the same thing. They're both Al-Qaeda. They merged, created the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant. They then became the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and then they became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. It's the same organization. It's just a name change by Western media, Western intelligence apparatus, State departments, that sort of thing. It's propaganda. It's not real. It's the same organization. It always has been. It always will be. And the same thing for the Free Syrian Animals, the Free Syrian Army, the FSA. They're nothing but beheading fanatics, rapists, murderers, scum. They're all the same thing. They're all part of ISIS, or whatever you want to call it. There are no moderate rebels in Syria. There never have been, and there never will be, because these are the people that the United States and Britain and France have supported. So it's not blowback. It's a coordinated attempt to terrorize the general public here at home, and to provide a justification for greater war abroad. Now, with that being said, I want to give you, we've only got a few minutes. Maybe this is not the best time to go into the Russian plane, since we've been focused on one issue this entire broadcast. I want to refer you to an article of mine back from November 7th, 2013, 11 Signs of a False Flag. And at the time I have left, I want to go through them, and I want to try to make this as clear as possible to people who may be new to this information. Number one is that it's a high-profile event. All right, the first question that you have to ask would be, is this a high-profile incident? The answer, in this case, obviously, is fairly obvious. If the attack takes place at the World Trade Center complex, causing the buildings to explode and collapse, or if it takes place at the White House or the Pentagon, it's high profile. If it takes place at the stadium during a football match, it's high profile. So the location can be factored in. In other circumstances, the act itself may be the major factor, like the case of the Sandy Hook Elementary School. That's a nationally unimportant location, but a horrific act that made national news nonetheless. So the most important factor, of course, is the media attention. And regardless of the location or the act, if the media picks up the story and runs the story simultaneously on all major mainstream channels, the incident is obviously a high-profile event. So that's one sign of a false flag, is it's extremely high-profile. Number two, changing stories, as I've just mentioned. In informed researching circles, it's well known that the information that comes out shortly after the event is usually the most reliable. This is not to discount the existence of confusion, again, as I said, related to the panic reports, coming from eyewitnesses who are still upset, etc. But the information coming out early on has not been subjected to top-down media revision that always takes place as the story becomes molded to fit the narrative that are pushed by the individuals who directed the attack at the higher levels of the intelligence apparatus or secret intelligence agencies, but also by the ones that have connections with the media, who are able to control the manner in which the media outlets report the event. And of course, we know the CIA and the media are heavily connected to one another, not just Operation Mockingbird. There's much more than that. So in times of false flag attacks, the initial reports, as I said earlier, you may have 5 gunmen, then you have 4 gunmen, then you have 2 gunmen. A few hours after the attack, all the references to the other gunmen are removed, and you'll just have this lone gunman. And if anybody says there were more gunmen, then you're a conspiracy theorist, that sort of thing. So changing stories is another major giveaway for false flag attacks. Simultaneous drills, that's number 3. One of the hallmarks of a false flag operation is running drills shortly before or during the actual act, the actual attack. Now, many times, these drills are going to involve the actual sequence of events that take place during the real-life attack. Remember, we had these drills being present on large-scale false flag attacks like 9/11 and the smaller-scale attacks like the Aurora shooting. We remember Webster Tarpley has a book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA. He lists at least 46 drills that were underway in the months leading up to 9/11 and on the morning of the attack. These 46 drills were all directly related to the events that took place on 9/11 in some way or other. We also have the 7/7 bombings in London, who were running drills of exactly the same scenario that was occurring at exactly the same times, exactly the same locations. One reason may take precedence over the other depending on the nature and the purpose of the operation drills that are used by false flag operators, for at least 2 reasons. And just, we don't want to go into too much detail here, but basically one purpose is the creation of intentional confusion if the drill is taking place during the actual attack. The other, the more effective aspect, is using the drill as a cloak to plan the attack or even go live when it comes time to launch the event. So even more than that, it gives the individuals who are involved in the planning of the event an element of cover, especially within the military intelligence or military and or intelligence agencies' tight chain of command structure, this need-to-know basis. So if a loyal military officer or intelligence agent stumbles on the planning of the attack, that individual can always be told that he's just witnessing the planning of a training exercise, and then to go back to work. It's not your business, need-to-know basis. And so this deniability continues all the way back to the actual going live of the drill. And after the completion of the false flag attack, coincidence theory is then used to explain away the results of that. Now, number 4, cui bono. We've got to ask cui bono, right? The most important question to ask immediately after any high-profile event is who benefits from it. if you're able to see a clear benefit to any government or corporation or bank, then you're becoming capable of seeing through the false flag attack immediately. Many of these questions can be answered by taking a closer look at the behavior of these organizations prior to the attack and then shortly thereafter. Let's try to go through these, and if I have time, because I see I'm running out of time, I'll come back and we'll delve into them a little bit deeper. Also, unanswered questions. Another hallmark of the false flag operation is relatively obvious. The presence of unanswered questions regarding the details of the attack, the perpetrators, the motive, so on. Although the media narrative that takes shape soon after the attack will ignore these questions, they're inevitably going to remain if observers are able to think for themselves and focus only on the information. Building 7 on 9/11, for instance, additional shooters at Aurora, Sandy Hook, those are examples. Number 6, the case is quickly closed. Once an acceptable patsy and cover story is chosen by the media, all other opinions and questions are refused airtime. Nothing that even slightly contradicts the official story is acknowledged as legitimate, and once this happens, the patsy, if it's still alive in rare circumstances, is charged, prosecuted, convicted, and largely a secret or shadowy proceeding. In most cases, the suspect is killed in the process or shortly after the fact, so it negates any first-hand contradiction of the official narratives. Either way, the case is closed very soon after the event. Number 7, the suspect's connections to CIA, FBI, or other intelligence agencies. This is very important. One key aspect suggesting a false flag that should be looked at soon after the attack is any possible connection the suspect or group of suspects may have had with intelligence agencies. A connection to any one of these organizations and institutions may go some length in explaining how the attack was coordinated, the motivation of the perpetrators, the actual involvement or not of the suspects, and who actually directed the operation. So, for instance, on 9/11, many of the alleged hijackers had previously had close contact with the FBI, the CIA, and other high-level intelligence agencies, both at home and abroad. We saw that with the Zarnev brothers. We saw that in virtually all of these attacks, and we saw that in the Paris attacks as well, with at least one of the suspects. Number 8, you need a convenient scapegoat. I'm running out of time here. One clue leading an informed observer to suspect a false flag attack is the existence of the convenient scapegoat. Remember, when we had Oklahoma City, the convenient scapegoat was Tim McVeigh and his right-wing extremists and the militia movement. On 9/11, the group was Muslims. It was Al-Qaeda. There was an LAX shooting one time. The perpetrator was an anti-government conspiracy theorist. Now, the convenient scapegoat that we are given now is, of course, ISIS. Number 9, the media promotes a narrative against the scapegoat groups and or an agenda to take liberties. All right, again, that's the same thing. Problem, reaction, solution. The Hegelian dialectic here. We have this group or perpetrators, individuals or groups that are identified by the officials in the media. Then they begin demonizing that group. And then they begin promoting solutions, whether this is erosion of liberties, greater implementation of a police state, economic policy, march to war, etc. Number 10, government begins to take action against the scapegoat or moves along the lines of the media narrative. In other words, the government jumps on the solution that was provided by the media or that it put out to begin with. And number 11, clues in popular media. You can always look for things that are essentially predictive programming that's more easily generally identified in hindsight, but we can get into those things. You had the connections with popular media and other terrorist attacks in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, we're running out of time. We'll have to catch up on some of these incidents and facts next week. Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.